Aloha, I'm Congressman Ed Case with another edition of my Congressman Ed Case Reports back to you on Hawaii Community Broadcasting. Today I want to talk to you from Washington, D.C. on what I think is one of the most critical issues that we face in our country today and will for a generation, and that is our federal budget. How we spend money, how we borrow money. Are we crippling our country with too much debt? These are issues that perhaps nobody likes to talk about, and in fact you won't hear them talked about very much in the day-to-day in Washington, D.C., and maybe that's because they're really, really hard issues. They're hard issues to talk about, they're hard issues to understand, and they are hard issues to find the right solution on. And so today we'll get into that, and before I come to our guest here today, I want to tell you that on the screen throughout the show you will see a number of ways to get in touch with me. I completely welcome your comments on this or any other issue. We are here to serve you. My mission here in Washington, D.C. is to make responsible decisions on national issues, of which this is one of the most critical, to help Hawaii here in D.C., and finally to help you with your individual issues. So please contact us off of the information. Now let's get to the subject at hand, and I want to introduce to you right now somebody that is absolutely qualified to discuss this issue, Maya MacGuineas, who's the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Now she says that's kind of a mouthful in terms of the name of a committee, but I think it actually adequately and fully describes what we need here, which is a responsible federal budget. So Maya, aloha, as we say, and thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. It's not just that it's a mouthful, it's also a laugh line so often when people say, oh, Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, when are we ever going to have that?
Yeah.
Which kind of is to the center of what we're going to talk about today.
Well, I don't know. What else would you call it? I mean, that kind of says what the purpose is,
It's a sentence, right? It's a sentence that explains what we're trying to do.
Now, before we kind of get into the committee and to the problem and to some of the solutions, let's just get to know each other. Tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you come to Washington, and how did you come to this job?
Okay, so it certainly wasn't planned out. I actually came to Washington by being born here, which is unusual. I am a third generation Washingtonian, wow. And you don't hear that much because it's a very transient city. But I grew up in Washington in a very non-political family. So nobody was in politics, nobody was in government, and I didn't really realize how different a place Washington is until I went off to college out in the Midwest and realized there are actually lots of places where people make things and they're real businesses, and this is a strange environment. And after that, I started my career in think tanks, and I loved the idea of just doing research and thinking about public policy issues. And I, even at the time right after college, was a diehard political independent, which I am today. And so I came back to Washington, but was definitely struck by how politicized everything is. Then did a stint on Wall Street. Didn't love it, but was really glad to have the experience of seeing how markets work in the world of finance. But you know how each job helps you figure out either what you do want to do or you don't want to do. I wasn't as motivated by kind of business and making money as a lot of folks there were. But I was really interested in how the stock market responded to what was going on in Washington and public policy. And most of all, I was really interested in these big budget deficits that I started reading more and more about.
Now, when was this?
So this is
dating back to your Wall Street days.
Yeah, mid-90s.
Okay.
Mid-90s. The budget, I believe, was the deficit was $203 billion, which sounded huge at the time, which sounds like a dream, an absolute success story right now, given how big it is.
And we'll get to this later in the show, but in the mid-1990s, the federal debt and deficit was a huge issue. It was the subject of presidential campaigns. And we will also get to the point that we did in fact solve the budget deficit at the time within about 5 or 6 years. So the hope is not lost here, but you were there in the middle of when it was really accelerating as an issue.
Right, it was much smaller relative to the economy than it is today, but much bigger as a political issue. And people really cared and worried about it, and there was all sorts of concerns about competition from abroad and what this was going to do to us market-wise. And so I ended up jumping back to graduate school and then came back here and ended up making a career as a nonpartisan fiscal expert.
That's the second time you've said that. So in other words, you don't come at this with any partisan bent.
You know, it's a huge part of it for me. Our board, and we can talk about them, many of them are partisans and they're bipartisan. But I think right now, the moment is so politicized. Almost every policy issue is so politicized. And I really look at this as fiscal responsibility as two things. One, about caring about the long-term health of a country. It's more than the short term. It's thinking about what's sustainable and what's going to work. And I also think about it as a fair system, kind of the rules for the game, which is, listen, Republicans and Democrats are always going to disagree on the size of government, some of the priorities of government. But step one is we need as a country to have a budget. We need to have some fair rules about how we decide what that budget's going to be and work from there. And right now what we're doing is focusing on the short term and often operating without a budget. But I do think for sort of credibility's sake and for everybody who's always trying to figure out, are you a Republican or a Democrat, where you're coming from, for me personally, I'm not coming at this from a policy preference, but just what things do you need to underpin a strong and sustainable economy?
Right. So in other words, we can disagree about policy. We can disagree about whether we should put more money into defense versus social programs. We can disagree over whether we should have, an allocation of X amount of dollars here, or a smaller government or a bigger government. But it always has to fit into some big picture, universal approach to
and in fact,
how we're going to run the country.
Are totally healthy. Of course we're going to disagree. There's no way that we're going to have a country with, everybody having the exact same preferences. So then you need a process to allow diverse opinions, like we have and which are a good thing, to come towards a focused plan and have a strategic operation of your country. So, yeah.
Okay, so before we get into the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, I'm just going to ask you a little sideshow, which is not what you wanted, but have you been to Hawaii?
No, but I'd love to. Come on, it's so easy for you being from the greatest state there is, and you know that every single person is like, I'm dying to go to Hawaii. I have never been.
That's a shock.
Do
I
you
think
need
we
some
probably
budget speakers?
We probably should have done this show right in the Ōlelo recording studio in Honolulu and given you an excuse to come out.
As I was driving here this morning, and it's a beautiful day after a couple days of rain in Washington, I did think everything's better with good weather. You're just a happier person, you're more charitable, road rage doesn't take over. Everything's better with good weather. And I actually think there is something to that. Living in such a beautiful place, it must really change kind of the deeper feelings of how people feel.
I think
Makes
so.
a difference.
No, I think so. Well, I think we do. We're an incredibly diverse state. We have many, many different people in the state. I think we've gotten used to and pretty good at getting along in a great, diverse society. We have our political arguments in Hawaii. We don't have too much road rage, but there's a lot of road anxiety. So we've got some of all of that. But we are.
It's fair to say everything's better in Hawaii. I think
of course,
you could get away
everything's
with
better in
saying
Hawaii.
that.
I'm
Pretty
on
honestly,
Hawaii Community Broadcasting right now.
Yeah.
And it's true. Okay, so Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. What is that?
So it's been around for decades, and it's an organization that was founded by some members of Congress when they left Congress and said, the problem is nobody cares about budgeting the right way. We care about our political fights, and as a result, we end up borrowing too much. This was in the 80s. And I think what's really unique about the organization is that the board of directors are people who have been in government. I haven't, but our board our co-chairs are Leanne Panetta, who has done so many jobs, but Secretary of Defense, head of the CIA, head of OMB, head of the Budget Committee here in the House. Mitch Daniels.
A member of Congress and a Democrat.
A Democratic
and a
former
strong
member
Democrat
of Congress.
when he was in office. So
Absolutely.
He's a committed Democrat.
Absolutely. He's not some squishy independent like I am. He is an absolutely strong Democrat. Paired with a strong Republican, Governor Mitch Daniels, who was the Republican head of OMB.
That's the Office of Management and Budget, which is basically,
yes.
We're going to have to stay away from the acronyms.
Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office.
Right.
Two of, in my world, the biggest organizations. Most people probably have never needed to think about them.
Running the federal budget.
Mm-hmm. One is inside the White House, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Congressional Budget Office, which is impartial.
Which is Congress's budget arm.
And so Mitch Daniels was then the governor of Indiana, and now he runs Purdue. And then Tim Penny, former member of Congress, who's an independent and is from Minnesota. So we have Republican, Democratic, independent representatives all across the board. We also have people who have run the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, the budget committees, all those groups that we just mentioned, the Congressional Budget Office, the Office of Management and Budget. But the thing is, they've been inside government. So we're not just some group on the outside that says, tisk, 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 you really should do this. It's people who've had the political experience to understand that fiscal responsibility is really important and it's really hard. And we're actually asking, all of us voters are asking a lot of members of Congress and our politicians to do the right thing on this issue, because at the same thing, we're asking for all of you not to. We're saying, please give us tax cuts, please give us more spending. Oh, we don't want to pay for it. So we're making it hard on our political leaders to make these choices. But so it's very realistic in how we try to work with members of Congress.
Mm-hmm. Now, if I was to just ask you, what's your mission statement, the committee's mission statement? What is the mission statement of the committee?
Focusing, so it's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focusing on educating the public, members of Congress, and the media about the importance of fiscal responsibility and trying to focus on solutions to get us there.
Okay.
And what we do, just to kind of explain, so we do a whole lot of policy work. We spend a lot of time analyzing the public policies that are out there, coming up with lots of ideas for solutions. We do a lot of work on Capitol Hill. We find, I don't know if you find this, but a lot of members don't have as much time to work in public policy areas as they would like. So we like to do a lot of convenings. I like to bring in speakers to talk about issues you may not get to hear every day. I like to do it in a bipartisan way so you can build friendships and relationships across the aisle. And then we also work with educating the media and try to get these stories out there. And in this next election, 2020, we will focus on running a big project trying to get the candidates to be accountable for the promises they make. Because if we elect someone who's promised huge tax cuts and huge spending increases, we're also going to get a huge debt. And so we want to put some pressure on them to actually figure out, how would you pay for this? How would you fix this problem? So make it salient in the election.
Okay. So for the viewers, when I was last in Congress, 2002 to 2007, I served on the House Budget Committee. I was worried about these issues, was working with the committee and with other members of Congress on a bipartisan basis to try to figure out how we could introduce some fiscal responsibility back into government. And I distinctly remember that when I left Congress in 2007, the national debt was $9 trillion. So let's talk about the national debt here just for a second. That's the amount that our government owes to somebody. The somebody could be any number of people. It could be you as a bondholder in our government. It could be various investors in our government that want to protect their money and what they view as what they have viewed, and that's one of the issues, as a safe investment, U.S. government securities, the promise of the U.S. government to repay people that loan it money. And it can also be foreign countries who also buy our bonds, so countries like China, countries elsewhere in the world. The point I'm trying to make here is that the debt was $9 trillion when I left, the total debt of our country, and that's a lot of money. That's a lot of zeros after 9, and maybe you can't, maybe it gets lost in the translation. But today, the debt, only 13 years after I left, the debt is $22+ trillion, $22+ trillion. So don't think about the zeros so much as how much it actually grew in that short a period of time. What happened?
Yeah, it's been a bad period for the national debt, for sure. The main thing that happened was that we had a huge recession in 2008. We had a huge economic downturn, and that has two effects on the debt. The first is that the government collects a lot less in revenues because the economy is contracting, and it spends a lot more because there are many more people who need unemployment benefits. The social safety net becomes overstretched, and there's a lot more benefits that are being paid out. So your deficit jumps up during a recession. The second is we borrowed a lot.
You're saying that in a recession what happens is that there's less money coming into government because there's less tax revenue because there's not as much economic activity going on.
Right.
And if you maintain government at the same levels of spending during a recession and or increase government spending or increase government debt, you're going to have a bigger gap.
Yeah, well, so what happens is you don't even have to change the programs, but there are a lot of programs that people qualify for when they need them, and there are a lot more people who suddenly need them during a downturn. People lose their jobs, they get unemployment benefits, they may qualify for food stamps, Medicaid may become more overstretched. There's more of a demand. So even without changing any of the laws, recessions mean that the benefits get paid to more people who need them. Something called automatic stabilizers, actually, which is, it's actually good for the economy during a recession to be borrowing more and spending more because it helps stimulate the demand. It helps, there's less demand from the private sector because all of us are feeling poor during a recession. So you have more demand from the government, and that helps things from getting worse. Mm-hmm. Then the second thing is if there's stimulus, and there was a big stimulus package in 2008. Some say it wasn't even big enough. And stimulus is something that you need to borrow more money on top of those automatic stabilizers to, again, help prop up the economy until the normal private sector can start to get back into equilibrium. Stimulus is a good thing. It's not always done right, meaning we will often borrow money and spend it on political favorites, not spend it well. Suddenly you have hundreds of billions of dollars and you're spending it really quickly. Guess what? That's not going to have the thought that goes into spending it perfectly. But stimulus is part of fighting a recession. You have two tools, the Federal Reserve and monetary policy, and Congress borrowing and fiscal policy. And so a lot of times people will think, as a fiscally responsible group, we would object to borrowing during a recession. And we hit trillion-dollar deficits back then, and I would get...
Trillion-dollar deficits, meaning this is the annual difference between what's coming in and what's going out.
So that was the first time we'd ever hit that. The first time we were actually borrowing $1 trillion in just 1 year.
When I was here the last time, we were worrying over deficits of 300, 400
That's right.
billion.
And remember, when I started, it was 200 billion,
right,
and
exactly.
I was terrified.
And actually, during the time that I was here, one of the principal causes of the deficit then was that we had to go into Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So we were borrowing all of that extra money to fund those particular necessary, I believe, efforts overseas.
And in fact, that was the first
perspective.
time this country had ever fought wars where we didn't raise taxes to at least pay for some of them. That was a different policy. We borrowed all of the money for the wars, and that was expensive. And again, being fiscally responsible doesn't mean not doing things. It means if something's worth doing, figuring out how you're going to pay for it or when you should spread the cost.
Maybe I should go back to even one more real basic here for the folks watching, and that is in Hawaii, we have one of the few places in the country that actually has a requirement for a balanced budget on an annual basis. Now, there are situations where you can get out of whack on a balanced budget, but fundamentally, what our state government has to do is to is for spending not to exceed actual and projected revenues, and so that has kept us in check, really.
Yeah.
So, we can borrow money to build roads and capital investments, but the interest, the payments that we make to borrow that money, just the same as any interest you pay on your home loan or on your credit card debt, the interest that we pay, that cash flow has to factor into the spending that has to stay within a balanced budget. Is that true with the United States government? Do we have a balanced budget requirement?
No. So, I mean, this is one of the biggest missing pieces of how we budget at the federal level, which is there's no budget constraint, to use the wonky term. But states, many states, not all states, but a number of states are required to balance their budgets and, as you said, have kind of smart outs for public investments, for things that will grow the economy. But there is a budget constraint. Now, the fact that the federal government doesn't have that in some way makes sense, because as we were talking about in downturns in the business cycle, there are times you want to be borrowing, and so you want some entity to do it, and that's the federal government. But the flip side of that is that in times of economic strength, for instance, now we're in a strong economy, you should be you're bringing your debt trajectory down. It used to be that we should be balancing the budget. Now we're so far away from balance, it's actually out of reach in the immediate future. But we shouldn't be growing our deficit.
When did we last balance our budget?
Oh, it was after the Clinton administration. We did for 3 or 4 years, and then we had big tax cuts. And
this was at the end of that 1990s decade. As I recall, the budget balanced in 2000. That was the first time we got it into balance for quite a while, on a bipartisan basis,
on a bipartisan basis.
This was President Clinton working with a Republican Congress, and everybody was concerned about getting that under control.
There were a lot of pieces that went into it. They had President Bush, who raised taxes, and you'll hear people who still say he shouldn't have, but it was an incredibly courageous thing to do. And then the Clinton administration that came in, and some people remember, I remember, Ross Perot, during this election,
of course,
forced this issue onto the national agenda. You had candidates who didn't want to talk about the deficit and debt. Ross Perot pushed them to, and that changed the entire Clinton administration, where they really made fiscal responsibility a large priority, and put in place a budget deal in '93 that was incredibly helpful, building on what had happened in 1990. And then there was also more bipartisan work where Senator Domenici and John Kasich also all pushed for more fiscal issues. And so there was some bipartisan work. Mm-hmm. And boy, is the centerpiece of this bipartisan cooperation, because you really can't fix it in a sustained way with one party alone. Mm-hmm. You need that cooperation, especially because it's so difficult. But to your point, I do think the federal government needs to have some constraints. It doesn't need, a lot of people like a balanced budget amendment. you'd have to craft one in a way that's very smart, which means there are outs for recessions and wars. There may be other things when you need to borrow. So you need some flexibility, but right now we have all the flexibility in the world, which means Congress can come up with a budget that says we're going to borrow whatever. They can borrow as much as they want. There are no constraints that are binding right now in our budget process. And so what we think is that you really need to add to the federal budget process, one, the requirement to actually get the budget done. We get the budget done now less often. We actually don't have a budget as often as we do these days. It's really irresponsible what's happening.
So just on the balanced budget amendment, I'm actually a co-sponsor with other members on a bipartisan basis of a balanced budget amendment. And maybe it's because I'm just used to working with it in Hawaii, and I know that it can work. Now, we have all kinds of arguments in Hawaii over, you know, how to tax and how to spend. But as you said from the very beginning, the underlying rule that we follow is that you have to have a balanced budget amendment, with exceptions. And the particular bill that I've introduced does have those outs.
I know it
does. So it says that if there's
workable.
a national emergency, it says that you can deviate from it on a supermajority vote. So it tries to relieve some of the pressure on a strict balanced budget approach. And there are going to be times when you need to have an unbalanced budget, so to speak.
Exactly, that's what makes it work. I mean, what you can't have is no flexibility, because we need to have the flexibility during emergencies, but we do need something that's going to push the issue, and it needs to have out. So in fact, we have looked closely at that bill, and that's a really good bill, which makes a lot of sense for how it could be workable. What worries me is if somebody says you always have to have a balanced budget, then we won't be able to stick to it. But if we build in the flexibility, that makes sense. We also need to have our political leaders who are willing to stick to it, which actually I feel some good news. I'm more curious what you think, but I feel more and more members of Congress are coming, really realizing how big this problem is. Can I turn this to you and ask, are you feeling that?
Little too early to say, in all honesty. The fact that we went from $9 trillion to $22 trillion in the 13 years that I was out of Congress would suggest otherwise, in all honesty. And but I do believe that the public is far more concerned about this issue than they were, and frankly, it's getting a lot more attention on the national news and in local news. And so I think that people are getting it. And unfortunately, I think that we now have almost a generation of politicians in Washington who want to tell you that budgets don't matter, that debt doesn't matter, that deficits don't matter, and don't worry about it. And some genuinely believe that it doesn't matter, and we'll get into this. But I think for most who take that position, they're simply scared of acknowledging the problem to start with. And the 4 stages of grief, as you say, denial, anger, acceptance, and resolution. I think people are just in denial still. And who wants to go back to their constituents and say, hey, we've got a tremendous deficit right now. We've got a tremendous debt. And this is where it's going to lead our country if we're not careful. And therefore, we have to operate on a much more fiscally sustainable basis. And that means some pretty tough stuff. The only way to get back to fiscal sustainability is to either grow revenues, which could come from increased economic growth, or taxes.
Or taxes, yeah.
And who likes to talk about raising taxes, or to control growth in federal spending, and who likes to say to their constituents, sorry, we can't afford that. So it drives us politicians to a very short-term view that all we're thinking about is that next election. And if we talk about the revenue side or the expense side, all of a sudden we're going to be threatened by somebody that's going to say, well, you really don't care. And I think that is still a little too prevalent from my perspective to answer your question. But shows like this, I hope, translate into people understanding what the real problem is.
Well, I think that's key. A couple of things. I think that's key, which is, one, when I talk to voters, when I go around and do town halls and things like that, I find them incredibly open to the issue. But they're not going to lead on it. If you have politicians who are saying to you, we'll cut your taxes, we'll grow your spending, a normal person is going to say, okay, that sounds pretty good. But if politicians are out there saying, this is why it harms the economy, this is why it's focused on the short term, this is why it leaves us vulnerable to issues in the future, I find people incredibly open to that message. But the second thing that you were saying, kind of on the extremes, if you have one side, either side, one side promising you tax cuts, and don't worry, they're free, they'll pay for themselves. Then you have the other side saying huge expansion and free this and free that, and don't worry, it will pay for itself. It becomes a political competition. And so I think that is what is happening, that the extremes are both making increasingly free lunch promises. But the good news that I still am feeling, it's those in the center who are willing to have a real conversation about this. I'm hearing more of it. And I think it's just because things are getting so bad.
I am hearing more of it. So I think that's encouraging. And to your point, I think that we are trying to maintain a fairly standard, well, standard is the wrong word, but we're trying to get back to, as we say, regular order on the budget, which is to pass a budget and to move out appropriations committees. I know I'm on the House Appropriations Committee now, and we're committed to moving those appropriations bills through. This is, believe it or not, for the viewers, unusual to do it.
It's really unusual.
It hasn't happened because people haven't been able to even agree on the ground rules for appropriations. We're having trouble doing a budget, that's for sure. But
and we need to go back to having these. I think this is the point you're making in that we need deadlines, we need budget constraints, we need rules that we're going to stick to. Right. And we have been so loosey-goosey with them for a long time that I think we need some stricter rules.
Right. I think the Budget Committee offers a Members' Day where a member of Congress can go to the Budget Committee and give his or her concerns and try to provide input to the Budget Committee. And I did go to Members' Day this year and gave my testimony. Actually, viewers can find it on my website. It's a televised, recorded testimony that you can check out at case.house.gov on the YouTube side of it. But what I said to them was, to your point about polarization of the process and the discussion, on one extreme, and this is an inside Washington baseball kind of a term, but it's called feed the beast and starve the beast. So starve the beast means the beast being the federal government and federal government spending. And on the political extremes, on the one side, there's a real desire to have that beast be a little smaller beast. And the way to do it is to cut taxes, cut revenues, and drive spending down. Now, of course, that's the wrong way to do it. At least from my perspective, it's an irresponsible way to do it. The other side is to feed the beast, which is let's increase taxes and give the beast more money, and then we can spend more. And to me, that's equally irresponsible because that drives up debt. So I said to the Budget Committee, somehow we have to break this feed the beast, starve the beast cycle and try to get out of it. So I agree. The discussion, at least, is being had right now, which I think is a tremendous part of a tremendous advance, because we really haven't been having that. So let me go back to the going up from 9 trillion to 22 trillion. So you talked about the recession, and that was a terrible recession for everybody. But was that the only reason?
No, we didn't finish. That's true. That's exactly right. So we had this economic downturn, then we had stimulus, and then we had just kind of a fiscal free-for-all. And it started smaller, where there were things, tax extenders, which are expiring, which people keep wanting to extend and not offsetting.
These are tax reductions that were on a sunsetted basis. So in other words, they weren't permanent. They were supposed to be for stimulus purposes, but they had an end date because they were a loss of revenue. So they came up for expiration.
Exactly. And people got used to it. And people keep making the case, well, it's there, it already counts, just extend it, don't pay for it. And that's kind of become a way of doing business, to the point that we're considering some tax extenders now that are retroactive of over a year. So, and people will be making the case, well, you need to pass these tax extenders to encourage behavior that's already happened or not happened. It's like gymnastics of tax policy. But we had some tax extenders, we had some changes in Medicare that weren't paid for, but then we had the biggies. And the biggie was the tax cuts that we had a few years ago, which have added upwards of $2 trillion going forward. Of our deficit this year, policies that we have passed in the past two Congresses contribute over 60% of the deficit. So these come from big policies that we've been passing right now.
Just the last 4 years?
Yeah.
Are 60% of this increase in the debt and deficit over the last...
This year's deficit.
I see.
Self-imposed.
So this year's deficit, so 1 year, which is $1 trillion, 60% of that $1 trillion came from decisions made in the last 4 years.
Tax extenders, some stuff in Medicare, the big tax cut, and some big increases in our spending caps. And basically what's happened, So we were talking a little bit about the things that can make the most difference. I think there's one single thing that could be the most useful in helping us stop the bad direction we're going in, which is pay-go, meaning that if you are going to pass a new policy, you offset the costs. Because we have been living in a pay-go-free world where people come up with ideas. Let's have a tax cut. Let's have a new spending increase. Let's lift the domestic discretionary and defense caps, and let's not pay for them. And that's not budgeting because it doesn't force you to make the trade-offs, which a balanced budget requirement or a debt target or any kind of rule would force you to, which is the first step in getting this done. And so then everything seems like a great deal if you don't have to pay for it. So pay-go requires that any revenue increase, any mandatory increase would be offset. I think that's the single most important thing that we could do first because we're living in a pay-go free world or a free lunch world. Okay. And that shows, so the economy turned down, things got worse, political infighting started growing, and then we started passing bills without paying for them. And that is how we got to the story where we are today. And just by the way, the debt held by the public, which doesn't count how much we owe to Social Security and other programs within the government, relative to the economy, it is the highest it has ever been in our nation's history other than one time just after World War II. This is the highest our borrowing has been. And we didn't have a world war, and we have a really strong economy. So the fact that we are running huge deficits relative to the size of our economy during a period of economic strength and relative peace, though I think there are real risks around the world we should be paying attention to, is so dangerous and such an indication of a country that has lost that fiscal discipline that would have said, how are you going to keep your budget on track? And one thing to jump around, but something when you're talking about the states I think is really important is that there is an out for borrowing for investment. There are times where if you're being responsible in the rest of your budget, you are more able to borrow for productive investments, which is something we're not doing enough of in many ways. And so without any of these constraints, you just see a fiscal free-for-all, which is where we are now.
Right. So let me come back to pay-go a little bit because I think this is one of the key fixes. Let me first of all let's just try to describe the problem just a little bit more. So not only did we have increasing deficits over the last decade plus and radically increasing debt for reasons related to the recession and to getting ourselves out of the recession, but also, as you say, self-imposed, because once we were out of the recession, we still cut taxes, we still didn't control spending increases.
And what we should have done is put our debt back on a path where it wasn't growing faster than the economy, and we did the opposite.
In other words, and by the way, we're sitting here talking about the federal budget and all this and that, and sometimes people have the impression that somehow the rules are different for the federal budget than my own personal my own personal
because we have a printing press or for some reason.
Or how I operate my business or how I run my home finances. They're not fundamentally different, right?
Yeah, no, they're not. I mean, people say, oh, you can't compare it to a household. A household's so much more simple. Of course, that's true. We have a Federal Reserve. We have the ability to tax. But the bottom line is you can't borrow indefinitely. And the things you should be borrowing for are the long-term investments, like one does for going to college, making a public investment, an investment in their house.
And when you're doing better, then you put your money away for a rainy day. You try to pay down your debt. You maybe invest in, improving your home or something like that.
And you save for the future. Right. We all know that bad things are going to happen. You save for those downturns, whether it's in the economy or in a household. So
now, a lot of the things that we're talking about, and you made the point that this is the worst since World War II.
Yeah.
And actually, that's true on many, many of the metrics with our national fiscal situation right now. But the one I do want to go back to, and that's because we fought an incredibly difficult world war in which we financed not only our own military efforts, but those of most of the rest of the country.
There's a strong reason for that.
Then turned around and reinvested in the rest of the world to get it back to prosperity through the Marshall Plan, and we did borrow that money. Mm-hmm. And so many of the issues that we're talking about, debt, deficits, but the one I want to focus on.
But we also brought it way, way down after we were finished.
Exactly.
We turned, and then during a period of strength, focused on our economy was stronger and our borrowing was much less.
And then into the 50s, we controlled it.
Yeah,
we didn't stay there. And the one that I want to talk to you about, you already mentioned this, but sometimes you can get lost in these debt and deficit numbers. But what you said was debt and deficits as a percentage of our national economy. So think about it. Think about it this way: you have your home budget. How much of your home budget can you devote to your home mortgage. If your home budget is, if your home mortgage comes up too high on your home budget, then it just sinks your entire budget. And that's the point here. It's the percentage of deficits and debt as opposed to our total economy that is really, really an important metric here. And it is, as Maya said, the highest since World War II. So that's a complete danger side. Now let me ask you one thing here, because I think we have to go back to a basic part of the debate. Some people say deficits and debts don't matter. Mm-hmm. Why should we be so worried about the situation we're in?
Yeah.
Why? I mean, because hey, there's a whole new school of economics out there. I think it's called what, modern monetary policy, MMP. Is that right?
T theory.
MMT.
Yeah.
And basically, the point of that is, don't worry, be happy. It's cool. It'll all work out, and we haven't tanked. Yet we're not like Greece. We're not like Brazil and Argentina, who have high debts and deficits, and look what happened to them. But look at us, we're just cruising along. Stock market is doing well, and we have record deficits and debts, and nothing has happened. So therefore, we must be running this okay.
You got it. These arguments are popping up everywhere right now. And so, I mean, the first thing I would just say, like, does anybody really believe when someone comes along and says, you can borrow as much as you want, or don't worry about what you're borrowing, it will magically make the economy so strong that it will be paid off? That sounds like a snake oil salesman, and this is not real. This is not possible that you can just keep on borrowing and nothing bad will happen.
You have some very prominent economists who are sitting there, who have a lot of alphabets after their name.
Yeah, kind of. Here's what you have. Some of the smartest economists pointing out something that's more nuanced and complicated that is interesting, which is the deficit and debt have grown and interest rates have stayed low and in fact come down. So what's going on there? And that's where you have some really smart economists saying we have to think about the situation and understand that the global economy has changed. One of the big reasons is we can borrow more from abroad. And that means that even if we need to borrow more, because we're still relatively politically stable and a good economic bet, a lot of countries want to lend money to the U.S. and that keeps interest rates low. The second reason is central banks, not just ours, but around the world, have been buying up U.S. treasuries because of quantitative easing, where they were buying the debt as part of monetary policy to deal with the global downturn. Third and fourth reasons are unfortunately not good news. Low rates are good in a lot of ways, but when they reflect pessimism about productivity in this country, which is one of the things that's contributing to it, and a shift in demographics, where we're becoming older, which means our economy's not going to grow as quickly as it has in the past. That's also pushing downward pressure on interest rates. So interest rates have been a lot lower than they used to be. So there are some very prominent economists saying, look at this, we're borrowing, rates are low. Maybe we don't need to worry as much as we thought we did. And that is true. However, what we do need to worry about is continuing to grow our borrowing relative to the economy. And the United States is on a trajectory where we have a plan right now that we will borrow $12 trillion over the next 10 years. That's if we do nothing. $12 trillion, not because there's a good reason to borrow it, but just because paying for things is really hard. And so
you're talking about doubling our debt over the next 10 years on one idea of the trajectory we should go at.
Yeah, so, growing it by 50%, basically. I mean, so
okay, yeah,
so,
sorry,
right?
22 by 10, yes.
So a massive expansion, not for any economic reason. And when people say, don't worry because our growth rate is higher than our interest rate or our interest rates are low, that would be true if we weren't borrowing anything else or we weren't so dependent on borrowing. But we're talking about borrowing so much that that our debt's growing faster than our economy, and the single fastest growing thing in the federal budget, interest payments on the debt. And I'll get in, and I'll talk about why it matters, because I do think, and this is really important for you or someone who talks to their constituents, getting people to understand how the debt affects them, really complicated, right? I understand how my skyrocketing healthcare costs, education costs, planning for retirement, job security, we all know how those affect us. We do not understand why the deficit or debt affects us, and we really can't see it or feel it. So it does affect our economy. When our debt becomes too high at the wrong time, it slows economic growth. We are already dealing with slower economic growth going forward because of this aging problem we have. So the last thing we want to do is have a debt that's making growth even more difficult too. What we want is a comprehensive economic growth plan in this country that would have everything from smart regulation policy, immigration policy, spending policy where we focus more on investments and less on consumption, and a smart debt deal. So those are things, each one of those would help grow the economy. But making your debt bigger stands in the way of it. That's why borrowing for the tax cuts or the spending increases like we have been actually harms growth in the long run. Second reason, though, is those interest payments that I mentioned, fastest growing part of the budget. Next year, we will spend more on interest than we do on children at the federal budget level. So that means we're going to spend more financing the borrowing from the past than our investment in our future. That is not a recipe for a sustainable country. It's not what we're supposed to be doing. It's not our hopes and dreams for our children, but it's also not how you keep an economy strong. And by 2025, we'll be spending more on interest payments than we are on national defense. Those numbers scare me. Those numbers look...
Which is somewhere in the range of $700 billion a year, as I recall. So
yeah.
We're really talking about interest payments starting to overwhelm the annual federal expenditures, because these are monies that they don't come out of nowhere.
Right, we have to pay interest first.
Yeah.
So it means we can't talk about how...
And if we don't pay interest on that, then
we default.
Then we default on our borrowings.
Then we default on our borrowing.
Then what happens?
So like you said, we're not Greece. We're not these countries around the world that borrow in different currencies and have a problem of defaulting because they can't pay. We can always pay, but if we chose not to, if we didn't and we defaulted, we would send shocks through the global economy and by all accounts put ourselves in a pretty dire global recession.
Right. So this is called, sometimes you hear this described as the full faith and credit of the United States. That means our country's promise that if you lend us money, you as an individual citizen or as an institutional investor, as a country, lend us money, we will pay you back that money when and as much as promised. So in other words, repayment with interest. And we have always honored that promise. And that's why people lend us money.
Yes.
That's why people didn't want to lend Greece the money. That's why people didn't want to lend some of the other countries this money. But we've always done that. But when we start getting things so overwhelmed with interest that people start to doubt whether we're going to lend the money, then two things happen. Number one, interest rates go up because we're a higher risk as a borrower. And number two, people just stop doing it to start with. And so we are relying on people being willing to borrow, to lend us money to finance this.
Yeah, we sure are.
This
it comes with a great advantage that this is why we can borrow for so cheap. And if we went and completely messed it up by not paying some of the interest payments that we owe, we would never regain that in the foreseeable future.
Right.
So I hope when we have to deal with the debt ceiling, which we will this fall, there is no talk about defaulting, that there is more talk about, okay, we're hitting a debt ceiling. That's a reminder we have too much debt. We need to lift the debt ceiling because we can't default. But what should we be doing at the same time that puts in place smart plans to help us not borrow so much, to not continue to grow
Okay,
our
well,
debt?
that's a good transition. You know, hopefully what we've done here is to describe how our government works from a fiscal perspective. I didn't
finish one thing that the MMT.
Oh yes, I'm sorry.
Right, just because it was such an important question, and you're hearing more about this. But people have now been making the case that because we borrow in our own currency, we can't default, and don't worry about it. We should spend as much money as we want until there's inflation in the economy. And this is a very dangerous idea. I think people who've lived through inflation would be more sensitive to just how scary and stupid this approach is, whereas people who haven't may not realize how damaging inflation can be at eating away your standard of living. But this idea says just keep spending money, and once there's inflation, Congress will pass huge tax increases, and then we won't have inflation that hurts the economy. First off, moving the responsibility to control inflation out of the Federal Reserve Board into Congress, which is a highly politicized body, is a very dangerous idea. I mean, you live this every day. People in Congress can find anything to fight about. We do not want to have the big levers of the economy being overly politicized. And second, the recipe of just borrowing more and more money to spend on everything puts us in a very dangerous position that when inflation or rates go up, it could be a huge crisis instead of something that's more manageable. It's not as though just because the tipping point is invisible doesn't mean you have to go find where it is. And MMT to me seems to be a theory of convenience that a lot of people, for political reasons, find it very appealing to make promises of huge amounts of spending and not having to pay for it. But
You're saying it's kind of a result-oriented theory.
It's
you start with what you want to do and then find a way to explain it.
And you make a really fancy-sounding name and you put it to it. But there are a lot of things we wish were true, and they're not. I'm not going to spoil anything about the tooth fairy. I just ruined that for my kids when I told. But that you can't wave a magic wand and wish these things to be true. The law of math still exists, and politically it's hard. But that's what leadership is telling your constituents, if something's worth doing, let's talk about how to pay for it.
Now, is modern monetary theory, MMT, is it gaining a hold in the mainstream of economic thought, or is it?
No.
Is it, how do the rest of economists feel about it?
MMT is not. Many influential economists, it's more on the left, and many on the left have been shooting it down. So there's a distinction. The free lunch stuff, either the laugher curve of don't worry, tax cuts will pay for themselves, which is a story people told during the tax cut debate, and they won't, and they haven't, and they'll add to the debt. Same with MMT. Don't worry, we can just print. No, that won't work, and if we try it, we'll really harm ourselves. So credible economists.
If we spend more, if we just borrow money and spend more, then that in and of itself, spending that money will somehow generate.
Yeah, that's going to be the key to growing the economy. It's really, you can't have an economy that's just resting on everybody spending so much money. You have to be focusing on investments and productivity, which is how you actually grow your economy per person. That's what's really important. Credible economists are not jumping onto the MMT bandwagon. What they are doing is discussing what you and I were talking about a few minutes ago, which is the economy has changed and interest rates are lower and inflation seems much more manageable. And globalization, not surprisingly, has made major shifts in our economy. Jumping from that to so we can borrow all we want, I think is a politically convenient and extremely dangerous line of thinking. But recognizing that changes are going on in the economy is absolutely right, and we have to update our understanding of this. And so interest rates aren't going to suddenly jump up in the next months, probably. Who knows what will happen with interest rates, but they seem to be staying lower. But what I worry about is that creates this enabling moment where we think we should just borrow more and more, because then when they do go up, that interest cost will be even more devastating to our budget.
Okay. All right. So we spent most of our time today talking about the situation, the problem.
I hope I've convinced everybody
now,
that things are...
Yes, I hope we have.
That it's a real issue. That's what I hope, because people get a lot of messages, don't worry about it.
Now in our remaining time, what do we do? And let me start with PAYGO, because you mentioned PAYGO, and PAYGO is a shorthand for pay as you go. And the idea of PAYGO is that for every action there has to be an equal and opposite reaction, to borrow from physics. In other words, if you reduce, if you're trying to get to zero in terms of your budget so that you're not creating a worsening budget problem with more deficits and more debt, then let's say you want to reduce taxes. And let's say you can justify that those taxes, as is correct with many tax cuts, that they don't end up generating more revenue than they lost from the tax cuts. So in other words, if you want to reduce taxes, you've got to have some offset for that reduction in revenue, whether you increase taxes somewhere else or reduce spending somewhere else. The effect is neutral. And similarly, if you want to increase government spending in any particular area, then to be budget neutral, you have to either reduce government spending in some other area or increase taxes to make up for the revenue increase. And so that's called PAYGO. And we have had PAYGO for 20 years now. In fact, PAYGO was how we got out of the deficits in the late 1990s. And we have it in place today, but why isn't it working?
Yeah, so PAYGO is probably the greatest budgetary invention and the one that's most likely to be ignored. And that's probably the problem, is because it works. People waive it regularly. So actually, after the big tax cuts were passed, PAYGO would have gone in place and said, because you just didn't offset these, we're going to have a big sequester or some spending cuts to offset it. But everybody voted not to have them because it was too punitive and it would have been painful. And actually, a lot of people voted to waive PAYGO and didn't know that's what they were doing, I found out later. So let me break it into three buckets of how we're going to fix this. The first is process, the second is policy, and the third is politics. On the process, I do think the very first rule of when you're in a hole is you stop digging. And that is what we have to make a commitment to. I would love to see a national commitment to stop making the debt worse. Right? There were years ago around the Simpson-Bowles Commission and other efforts, there was a real chance at putting in place a big deal that would improve the debt. That's still the right thing to do. And this economy is the right moment to be doing it. but we don't have all the stars aligned that we're ready. So I do think, though, there might be some openness to a bunch of a real commitment nationally not to make the debt worse. And the way you do that is pay-go. And you can pair it with spending caps. We have some spending caps right now that are too aggressive. Nobody wants to live with them. And we should lift them and offset the costs as we lift them. So we should put them at levels that people can stick with and agree that all new policies would pay for. So that's the process, pay-go.
I'm sorry, just to translate that just for a second. So at the moment, we do have laws in place that cap how much spending we can have.
Right.
And they similarly have real life consequences to exceeding the caps. And what you're saying is that in some areas, and I agree with you, it's very hard to comply with those caps and actually do justice to the basic functions of government, of which there are many. But if you are going to lift those caps, then find a way to be budget neutral on lifting those caps.
Exactly.
So in other words, either you find a way to reduce spending some other place, and or you rescind some of the tax cuts of the last couple of years, and or you raise taxes in some other way.
Exactly. I mean, that's
and those
what
are
budgeting
tough
is.
things to talk about.
They are tough things to talk about, and they are honest and they are real, and that's what like what you just said there is exactly right. Like, if we don't want to live with those caps, and many people think that they're too low to be sustainable or make sense, I'm one of those people. I think they're probably too low in some places, and in others they are fine. Let's lift them, and then let's figure out how to pay for them. And you just gave the right choices. So yes, so I think in this process area, and so I would put along with pay-go, like you said, a balanced budget amendment that has the openings so that's flexible when there are emergencies, and or debt targets, which would mean each budget would be required to meet a certain level of debt, and or real consequences when we don't pass a budget. So if Congress doesn't pass a budget, we think Congress shouldn't go forward and pass any other bills that affect the budget. So until there's a budget in place, we shouldn't be passing spending bills or tax cuts. So those are some of the process reforms. Pay-go, figuring out balanced budget requirements, debt targets, accountability. Those are really important. And I think we can make some progress on those. The second is actual policies. And you just started to talk about them. And what we need as politicians to do exactly what you just did. Lay out the choices. We can cut some spending. First off, we have to fix Social Security and Medicare. I know it's an issue a lot of people are concerned to talk about. The trustees tell us every year these programs are on course to be insolvent. Saying that we need to fix them isn't saying how we can fix them. That's the next step of talking about whether it's reducing the growth of benefits, changing the way you calculate inflation, retirement age, tax increases. There's a whole lot of possibilities. But not doing something means we're going to have across-the-board cuts for people who depend on Social Security and Medicare, and that's just wrong.
That is wrong. It's unacceptable. It's not going to happen. I'm firmly convinced of that. But at the same, we could do a whole show on Social Security and Medicare, and maybe I will do a whole show.
Yeah.
But think about it this way: the issues that we've talked about in terms of the overall federal budget and deficits and debts apply equally and in their own way to Social Security and Medicare, where essentially we are having an increased divergence between the track of people that need Medicare and the monies devoted to, and the revenues that are going into Medicare and Social Security as well. So we have a fundamentally unbalanced situation going on. We have time to fix it. And that's the good news. The bad news is that time is frittering away to fix it, and so nobody wants to fix Social Security and Medicare in an emergency situation.
Yeah.
But they also impact the overall federal deficit.
That's right. So we need to focus on them because those programs matter, but they also do affect the national debt. And so you can't just budget in kind of pieces of the pie. You need to understand the whole pie. But so other policies, you talked about we could repeal some of the tax cut. Another option we have is when we did the tax cut, we lowered a lot of tax rates, but we didn't broaden the tax base, which is normally what you also do. We have over $1 trillion in tax breaks in our tax code every year. And they're popular things. People like tax breaks. But we could look at limiting them. So I came out with a proposal many years ago with Marty Feldstein saying, what if you limited the amount of tax breaks relative to your income that any one taxpayer could have, so you didn't have people having huge tax breaks because they took all of them. Or we can talk about new taxes, whether it's carbon taxes or value-added taxes. There's a revenue component and there's a spending reduction component. And Defense is a tricky one. I think that defense needs to be thought of as security policy, but I will make the argument that I worry that our defense budget is focusing on the wrong things, kind of the threats of the past, and some very, very big benefits that are probably outdated, whereas we have some big threats of the future that we need to change and update our defense spending. But I'll leave that to the experts. But we need to look through the budget, pare back our spending. I think we need to think about raising the retirement age. That's a tough one to talk about, but we're living much, much longer, and we can't afford to be retiring at the same age that we were when Social Security began. But we just need to talk about these as trade-offs.
We have done that before. We're not talking about raising it for anybody that's anywhere close to retirement age, but we have actually adjusted our retirement age in the past, where people had 20, 30 years to prepare for an adjustment.
Today, they'd say fine,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they're going to be living much, much longer.
Yeah.
And for people who can work longer, we should. And for some people who have jobs where you can't work longer, we should have a strong security disability program where you wouldn't have to. You can get your benefits early. But we need to be thinking about these on the policy side. And then the third piece I would say is you can't do this in a partisan way. It has to be bipartisan for two reasons. One, like we started talking about, people have diverse opinions. And that's great. That's exactly what it should be. Like, no one person's opinions are right, and this country was founded on knowing how to compromise. So Republicans and Democrats working together to come up with a fair compromise that reflect all their constituents' points of view. That seems to me the way you run a country.
Now you talked earlier, and obviously that is the way that one would want it to happen, but it hasn't happened.
No, and it's becoming less and less.
You talked earlier about what you referred to as the Simpson-Bowles Commission. Could you talk just briefly about, why was that created and what was the idea there?
That was a tremendous commission about 10 years ago that had Republicans, Democrats, members of Congress, and outside experts came up with a plan that would have reduced the debt by $4 trillion in some really smart ways. It included revenues, included spending reductions, it fixed Social Security, and it did all of these in ways that made sense. They both helped grow the economy, and they protected people who depended on the programs. And they reflected some of the most conservative values to some of the most progressive values because they worked together, they got to understand each other, and they came up with some compromises. It's honestly a plan that's so smart we could dust it off today and implement it and be in much better shape.
The plan that Simpson-Bowles came up with was a good plan. It was a tough plan, a hard plan, but what I want to focus on, and we're running out of time here, was the process that it followed. Fundamentally what Simpson-Bowles did, and it was true for other commissions, and it's kind of sad to say this, but the idea was, Congress, you can't do this yourself, so therefore get an independent commission, bipartisan commission outside of Congress to crunch through the really hard decisions and come up with a recommendation to Congress, and Congress can vote yes or no on it. Yes or no. You got to take all of it at one time or none of it. And unfortunately, as we know,
it really kind of outsourced those hard choices, which, given how partisan and tough things are right now, we might need that. We might need some outside experts making recommendations, and then Congress says, "Ugh, I don't love it, but I'll do it."
Well, we have amazingly run out of time.
That went by fast.
Very, very fast, and I completely appreciate that. I hope you're able to get to Hawaii, but before you get to Hawaii, we will honor you with a little bit of our macadamia nuts from Hawaii.
Yes,
it's
I
called
love this looks delicious.
Maya, thank you so much for joining us here and
giving
us a little bit of a sense of the challenges we face. I think we would both agree that with a little commitment, we can, in fact, solve this problem as we had before. Hope you enjoyed this particular show on Congressman Ed K's reports. Hope you will appreciate the magnitude of this challenge and of fixing it and the opportunities to do so if we all are in this together, which I think we are. Please contact me at the information provided on the show anytime. I look forward to hearing from you, and until then, ahui ho, aloha.